And the recording and perhaps some slides will be put up on the Baker Programming homepage in a couple of days. So please feel free to revisit today's conversation and share with others. And also feel free to share with your networks. The programs are open to all. And so I think that's it for housekeeping. And so let me get started without further ado and welcome Jarrett Dapier. Jarrett is a former student of mine, so I am fully biased towards Jarrett. But seriously, so very grateful that he could join us today on this important topic. And it's really interesting. You know, Jarrett is a teen librarian and also has some really amazing picture books out. So we'll be talking perhaps a little bit about these dual interests during the Q&A. And just when he gets started, I'm going to pop a link into the chat on this topic of policing in libraries, which can be controversial, but it's also so very important. He wrote a really great editorial with Dr. Emily Knox, a mutual friend of ours, on this topic, and they have presented on this topic at various conferences and really wanted to bring him to this critical conversations to share some of this conversation with us. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jarrett, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cook. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I've been excited about this for a long time because you asked me if I'd be interested in doing this, I think last summer. So I'm noticing from the chat that most people seem to be in dreary climes at the moment. A lot of weather that doesn't sound inviting at all. It's the same here in Chicago. It's like 44 or it's 34 and just started to snow. So I don't want to go out there again. Hi, hey Faye. Faye's in Wheeling. That's kind of near me. So again, thank you so much for having me. Thank you everybody so much for being here. The presentation that I'm about to talk you through is one that I've adapted from a presentation that I've given a couple times now, as Dr. Cook mentioned, with Dr. Emily Knox. Dr. Knox and I, since I think it was last March, have given multiple presentations on this topic, specifically with the Black Caucus of the American Library Association. We did 2 conversations about this, and then also a presentation sort of based on those 2 conversations and what we've learned from those conversations at the Black Caucus's annual conference this summer. That was in July. I've also given this presentation to, I've gotten more and more requests, thankfully, from library systems and people who, it's usually not an administrator, it's usually somebody who maybe their number came up for suggesting a professional development topic, or they actually are responsible for professional development and they might have seen one of our presentations before, but often it's not a director or an assistant director. But it might be someone within the managerial staff at libraries. So I've presented at the Iowa City Public Library, as well as Dr. Cook and I just a couple weeks ago did a presentation for the Northwest Ohio Regional Library System. So there were a number of, excuse me. Oh my God, really? Am I still here? Okay. I'm still here, right? For some reason, my phone okay, good. Sorry. My phone completely decimated the presentation for a second there. So yeah, I was thankful for that because there were a number of Ohio libraries on the call and a lot of great questions and a lot of conversation got activated from that presentation. So if any of you know of if any of you are associated with a library that you think needs to hear this more specifically for staff, Iowa City, for example, was one where we pre-recorded it and then staff were shown basically the conversation at their staff training day. So we can make anything work. And Dr. Knox is also usually game for joining me, but I'm very happy to be here. So what I'm going to present to you is adapted from the presentations that we've given, and it's updated. So Yeah, we can skip to the first slide. So it's policing libraries in the fog of implicit bias. I should also note that in addition to my editorial with Dr. Knox, I wrote one in Library Journal with my former colleague, Angela Jones at the Skokie Public Library. That was called The Fog of Implicit Bias. And specifically, Angela pushed me to write it, and I invited her, please write it with me, because after reading the original editorial, she thought it was too short. American libraries had given me way too little space to explore such a complex topic. And I didn't even get the chance to talk about implicit bias, which we'll definitely get to, because it's central to the question of how do we reduce policing in libraries. It has to be addressed. Implicit bias has to be addressed and acknowledged if we are to do this work at all. So thank you all for being here. I say a lot that this topic this topic is a life or death issue. It's not abstract. It's not, philosophical. It has to do with the health, safety, and lives of our patrons. Because when policing is involved, those things are threatened. And I've had libraries say, well, we don't have patrons of color here, so what's the problem? And I would argue that you don't have any patrons of color, because I don't believe it. Also, we can't just assume that police brutalize people of color only. There are countless instances of police brutalizing people with physical disabilities, people with cognitive disabilities, people certainly in mental and emotional crisis, regardless of color. Though, of course, people of color are even more, all told, at risk of violence and brutalization and harm, not to mention incarceration. But yeah, when you bring the police into any situation, regardless, you are bringing in loaded guns, actually, and also oftentimes the cops themselves, tightly wound, and they're trained in a way that is not, it's not prone to nuance. Let's put it that way. So with that in mind, some of you who have seen my previous presentations will be familiar with this, but those who haven't, I'm going to talk through this situation that happened at the Skokie Public Library when I was there about, I think it was 3 years ago. And what happened was, it was the start of the school year, very early September. I'm a teen librarian, so I see lots of teens, and the summer is usually pretty quiet, but then school starts and we get this influx of teens that we haven't seen all summer. They're usually every day after school. And there was this boy that we'd never met before who was there, and immediately he was on our radar because we were just chatting with him, just to get to know him. And he seemed to not be telling the truth about what school he went to or what grade he was. And at that time, we'd had a number of teens who were actually middle schoolers lying to say that they were 9th graders, 10th graders, just so they could hang out in the cooler space. So we were sort of just had our eye on him. We got to know him a little bit. And anybody who's worked with teens knows that at the beginning of the school year, and this is an example, which I'll talk about later, of anticipatory prep work, anticipating the needs as well as the situation that our patrons find themselves in from day to day, from month to month, season to season. So teens at the beginning of the school year in Skokie often bring in a lot of anxiety and a lot of energy and a lot of just a lot of activity that, is often very positive, but then also it is born of stress for a lot of them, especially freshmen. And this individual one day was just trying to get something out of the vending machine. He was trying to get a bag of chips. It was like 8:30 at night, and the vending machine ate his dollar. And when it did that, it just seemed to be the last straw for this boy. He lost his temper in a major way. Started kicking the vending machine, shoving it, which also is really, really dangerous. But he was cursing it out and making enough noise that it drew the notice of a librarian who was in another area that was outside of this cafe space. She heard it, and she called our safety officer. That was the right move. However, the safety officer that was on staff at that point, she was a former police officer, and I became pretty good friends with her, and I care for her and like her a lot. However, she had to undergo a lot of training to become a more empathic, compassionate, and patient person, because her training that was embedded like in her psyche was yell, neutralize, and get the problem out of here. And over the years, she really did get better. However, she never really interacted, like teens never responded to her tone or sort of her vibe very well. So she comes in and immediately, whatever it was she said, just it exacerbates the problem. He's yelling, he's cursing her out, and he keeps just wailing on this vending machine. And finally, whatever level of noise, the person who had originally called safety called the police. They didn't come in to see the situation. They just heard it, and it sounded out of control. And they also, I assume, saw a very tall, for his age, boy who was Black going in originally into that room. So she knew that this person was a Black boy, and she called the police, even though he had not threatened the safety officer. He was punching an inanimate object, and whatever was going on, there was no de-escalation going on. And one of the biggest mistakes I believe that happened is that the person who made the call to safety didn't also call either A, our librarian in charge, or B, and I would even say actually this should be A, the young adult librarian on staff, because my colleague Jenny is an incredibly empathic, sweet, very kind person who knows how to talk to someone so they feel like, oh, this person cares about me. And if Jenny had been called, I truly believe that this boy would not have ended up as he did, which is in handcuffs. If she had arrived, I bet she would have calmed him down to the point that he would have been okay, just probably leaving the library. However, what happened was the police arrived. This antagonized the boy way more. And we, at that point, had no information whatsoever about the boy's previous interactions with the police. Trauma he may have suffered at the hands of the police, trauma that his family and friends may have suffered at the hands of the police, the very complex and painful emotions that might have arisen in him from those traumas. And then on top of that, just the fact that he was a teenage boy being surrounded by multiple officers, he didn't react well. You know, people always go, well, why didn't you just follow orders and directions? And that's real easy to say, and usually is something that people say from a position of privilege, because they've never felt threatened by the police. That is myopia, because it assumes that my experience is the only experience. And if my experience with the cops have always been good and they've always been on my side, then that must be the way it is with everyone. And this boy must be a bad guy. And he ended up handcuffed and led out to a squad car in front of patrons who were leaving the library at 9 o'clock. So I'm sure at your libraries, you see all these people flooding out. That's what was happening. And there he is, a 14-year-old boy in handcuffs on view for everybody, getting put in the squad car. I was trying to get information from my former supervisor about this information or this situation to see if he was actually arrested. I don't know if that incident actually led him to officially be part of the criminal justice system. But you can bet if he hadn't already been on the radar of local police, he was now. And what's the problem with that is that anytime teens or young adults, just dudes in their 20s, anybody are doing something, or somebody calls the police and says they saw a tall Black guy, they might think of this boy. And so regardless of the fact that he might not have been put into the juvenile justice system as a result of this, he was on their radar, which means he was threatened from then on and was a target. And I put the device at the bottom. the iPhone, because it just really quickly, there was another incident about 8 years ago at the Evanston Library when I was there, when my supervisor had gotten a brand new iPhone as a birthday present, and she left it on the desk and she left the space, and a couple boys walked by. One of them grabbed the phone and they ran, and she realized quickly what had happened. I'm not sure if she called the police, but somebody called the police. And turns out the boy who grabbed the phone, he felt horrible. And luckily, my supervisor, very kind person, the police sort of mediated a conversation between the boy and her. And she just said, I just want my phone back. I just want it back, please. I know this was like an impulse thing. And turns out the boy, felt pressured by his friends to do something cool and crazy, but he instead, he didn't even steal it. He had, on their way down, hidden it among the stacks because he didn't actually want to steal his phone. So that was sort of a good story in a way, because the police officer worked it out with him and her. But again, we don't know what happened after that. Did the police officer say, what's your name? Take down numbers, all these different things. Is he on the radar now? And I guess the question is, people say, well, theft is a real crime. Why shouldn't the police be involved? The thing is, after the theft has occurred, do you need them there right now? And the reason I mention that is because police are not very good at investigating in the moment. They come in ready for action. And yes, there are investigators. Yes, there are detectives. And I think they have much more of a place than beat cops when it comes to handling situations that are not violent or murderous or, just physically dangerous. And I still wonder, whether the police should have been called in that situation. And who knows, if they'd left the library and then the police were chasing a couple boys across town and then they caught them, who knows what would have happened to them, and would that phone have been worth it? It was replaceable. And so let me just check one thing here. What if we just given the boy in the vending machine $1? We had petty cash at the desk. Just say, I'm sorry, here's some chips. And I can guarantee you that in all likelihood, the boy had not had any food since lunch. When we saw behavior like that amongst our middle schoolers and teens, it was almost always because they were hungry and they were tired. When we started offering free after-school lunches to youth 18 and under, our incidences, especially with middle schoolers, plummeted. And by incidences, I mean just hyperactive, disruptive, sort of rec center, like running up and down the stacks, sort of misusing the space, that plummeted. And it was incredible to see. The only reason our high school incidences didn't plummet as much, although they did, is because the high schoolers often thought the food was really gross. They didn't want cheese and crackers and little like packets of like squeezy peanut butter. But middle schoolers, because they're still kind of little kids, they were cool with it. Can we go to the next slide? So as library workers, do we want to be responsible for a child's or anyone's induction into the criminal justice system? And a caveat to that question, or sort of an asterisk that I add, is especially if the reason for that person's induction into the criminal justice system is our own bias, our own mistake, our own racism, our own bigotry, or implicit biases that lead us to think something is going on that is not what's actually going on. Shouldn't we, as library workers, be more attuned to not just the information we provide to our patrons, not just the information world and the information, organization concepts and literacies that we fight for, but shouldn't we also be privy to the information our own bodies give us? Our bodies are always sending signals of note, whether they be valid or not. And especially in a time when our media is full of misinformation that whips up anxieties that implant themselves inside of us and actually can cause physical feelings of fear and danger, shouldn't we be more attuned as information professionals to the information inside our body and whether or not we can trust it? And this is very close to my heart because I'm just learning a lot about anxiety right now because of some struggles that my own son is going through. And I'm learning a lot about like the signals that our brains send us and how they're rooted in the biology and the evolution of our species, and how a lot of times they're holdovers from a previous time when we needed fight, flight, or freeze to survive. But the true danger and nature of implicit bias and things that we don't even analyze or truly reflect on, that we think about other people or feel about them, are often unconscious. And we have to root those out because that's information inside us that can affect our behavior, our actions. And I think that we need to, if anything, go to therapy. If that, and that's not accessible for a lot of people, we just need to do a lot of work to be better information services providers, but also caretakers of not just our spaces, but our patrons and their safety in the spaces. And oftentimes the signals can get mixed that says, oh, well, that's what I'm doing by calling the police. That's what I'm doing by telling this person they're suspended or expelled. I'm protecting the other patrons. But we have to be really careful about whether we're doing that because of authentic threat or because we've been told by our bias that that person's a threat, when in fact we've misinterpreted the situation whatsoever and haven't seen their humanity. ProPublica wrote this article about this Rutherford County judge who is just like the most ageist public figure I've seen in a long time, who has been locking up 8 and 9-year-olds. And it's an incredible investigatory article. And the reason I bring it up, and I do have it in the sources at the end, is that once, and like I mentioned, once a name is in the system, that person is in the system. It can completely affect their lives and their experience and their, as an adolescent and as a young adult and as an adult, in ways that one day it's this way and the next day, because of that interaction with the police, their life is on a completely different track. We have to be careful as caretakers of the public. So why do people call the police? If we can go to the next slide. This is, oh, thank you, Louisa. Louisa posted that ProPublica article, which it's long, but I highly recommend it. And also thank you to Sarah for that, Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth. I would call that, I would make that mandatory reading for anybody working with the public. Any teacher, any community service worker, any librarian, library staff, library worker, especially library administrator. The fact that in 2021, we're still hearing about Black preschoolers being expelled from multiple preschools for behavior that is developmentally appropriate and on the correct timeline of like development, and the fact that they're a 4-year-old being expelled and what that communicates to the child. The fact that we're talking about it in 2021 as a thing that still happens all the time is utterly shameful and infuriating. I was an undergrad in the late 90s, and I remember studying that phenomenon in sociology class and social work classes. And then it was infuriating to me. But the fact that it's 21, 22 years later, and nothing has been done to address the fact that this happens over and over is just shameful. And it applies to us as library workers, because whether or not you're a circulation staff and you're public facing, and you're checking out books, or you're a person on desk in the children's room, what biases you have about Black youth and Black males and Black females and Black non-binary folks, like what biases you have are going to affect your actions and how you interact with those people. So this is an example of, I filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the Evanston Police Department. And what I asked was, because when I was at Evanston Public Library, I felt like the cop, I mean, this is anecdotal, so don't take it at face value, but I felt like the police were there all the time. And not in the teen room, luckily, because we were sort of this like free floating island of, I don't know, we were our own sort of haven. But I felt like every time I went down to the second floor, which was adult services, I saw police. And every time I was on the first floor, I saw police. I saw squad cars out front all the time. So I was curious when I started doing this work, why are they being called so often? So I filed a FOIA that asked the police department specifically for records of calls made to the Evanston Public Library between 2017 and like March 1st, 2020, because I think after 2020, there'd be zero. But I wanted a good chunk. And as you can see here, the reasons for a lot of these are, and I want to zoom in on this. Is there any way you can zoom in on that? Oh my God, it's doing it again, decline. Yeah, thank you, Louisa. For some reason, my zoomer doesn't work, but yeah, theft, vagrant, and unwanted person. So this is just a snapshot from many pages of records that I got, and this is all they looked like. But no worries, Kira. The fact that unwanted person is a designation I thought was pretty telling. Who gets to be a wanted person and who gets to be an unwanted person in our spaces? You know, who is allowed to be there and who is allowed to be there, but they better behave better than the other people who are allowed to be there. Otherwise they're out. So yeah, theft, unwanted person, vagrant, and there's a lot in there of unwanted person. And then yeah, stay on that one, Kira. So this is one that I just received, a FOIA sample from the Skokie Police Department. I filed same thing, 2017 and 2020, calls to the Skokie Public Library. And it's funny because I always thought, wow, when I was at Evanston, there were way more cop calls and police presence than Skokie, and I was completely wrong, which is, I think, reveals the extent of that we should rely on anecdotal evidence. So Skokie Public Library has had just as many calls, maybe a little less than Skokie than Evanston, but in the Skokie Police, I thought it was quite interesting that they didn't, I don't think they have unwanted person per se. Exactly, what is selective enforcement? So both the Evanston results as well as the Skokie results lead to all sorts of questions for me. I want to know, you know, who is an unwanted person and why? What is selective enforcement? And then also in here, excuse me, getting really close to your screen, but there's theft and then suspicious incident and then disturbance. And then not just disturbance, but there's at the bottom noise complaint. So when you think about this, so luckily the mayor of Evanston has told me that if I wanted to pick certain calls from the FOIA to Evanston, he'd be willing to look into the details behind those calls if the records still exist. And I don't know that I'd have that kind of access at Skokie, but disturbance, theft, assist citizen, selective enforcement, disturbance, suspicious, and noise complaint. So the ones that really raise red flags for me are disturbance, selective enforcement, suspicious incident, and noise, because those seem like they could encompass anything. And this indicates to me that, wow, people were getting the police called on them much more often than I realized, and for reasons that I have to argue probably did not call for armed backup, armed men or women, armed forces. People are having, that's great, Amy. People are having the police called for being human. That's absolutely right. But a kind of human that is somehow doesn't fit this, our idea of the space that we're creating, because of how they look, because of how they act, because of how their voice sounds, because we think they're drunk when maybe they actually have a neurological impairment, because we've jumped to conclusions. And I should say, in defense of both Evanston Library and Skokie Public Library, there's no indication in these records as to whether or not the staff at these libraries were the ones doing the calls. And that's a big thing that I want to reiterate a lot is oftentimes these calls are made by patrons on other patrons. And they're done oftentimes without any knowledge, without the library staff having any knowledge that those calls were made. I do remember that at both, oftentimes I'll ask, why are the police here? And librarians I talked to and staff I talked to were like, I don't know. Nobody seemed to know. That is an open question that Dr. Knox and I have really asked a lot of audiences, is like, how can we cut down on this? How can we cut down on, because there's no way we can control what our other patrons bring into the space. There's no way we can control some guy seeing something and saying that's dangerous or that's real, that's like gang stuff, and just calling the police and bringing the police in. And so it's an open question. If anyone has ideas, how do we cut down on patrons doing this? One that we talked about was signage. It's often the case that patrons have no idea that actually library staff are there to help, not just with like, where can I find this book on Vietnamese cooking, but also, hey, this guy next to me is really creeping me out and I think he touched my leg. We're there to help with all of those things, and we should be trained and available to handle those situations so that we can cut down on external armed forces coming in. Kiara says, I experienced that as a library director, an employee who was notorious for this. So Kiara was the employee notorious for calling, just like on a dime? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So that's a huge, absolutely critical point. As white women, they were scared of black males just being their authentic selves. Kiara writes, holding implicit bias trainings for patrons, but also having signs across the library to encourage them to seek assistance from staff if needed. So that's the best that we've come to, is like, hey, we're here to help. Hey, did you know if there's an issue, we can help with X, Y, and Z, more signage for people. And then also, letting just any interaction we have with staff, like we know they're settling in to study for 4 hours, just let you know I'm here. And if there's any kind of concerns or issues, please come to me. Okay. I'm just right over there. And I think that oftentimes will go a long way and may cut down on situations like the one that I was a part of, where there was a group of black males roughhousing out on the village green right outside the library, and multiple patrons walking in were like, there's gang warfare going on. And I say that in quotes because, or like sort of sarcastically, just because that's the thing, is the implicit bias that they've learned from so much media and so many messages to them throughout years have said that, a group of black males sort of wrestling or just using their bodies in a way that's not like, doesn't look controlled to me, is a threat, and therefore there's something bad going on. So they called the police, and I was out there, talking to them like, hey, we're getting some complaints about you guys like yelling and stuff. But But then while I'm standing there, the police pull up. And it's always a shock when that happens. But the police showing up, changed the situation completely. Yeah, videos on the web, I like that too. Especially like when we get a little further down, and we should keep going, that I want to mention is a lot of libraries or library staff will say, yeah, I got no budget for any of this. So what am I supposed to do? And it's an incredibly valid question, and I'm not going to pretend I have the answer to what you do when you don't have access to the kind of trainings and practices and professional development that I'm going to talk through. Can we skip to the next slide? So I don't mean to be, oh, let's see. Did you do the slide before that one, Kira? Oh, weird. I didn't. Okay, I'll just talk through it. So I had a slide between that one and the previous one that said our diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings enough for staff to tackle this very complex issue. And the reason I asked that, I had a post or a article from the Daily Northwestern from just a month ago that said specifically, the headline was, Evanston Public Library apologizes for using thin blue line flag in display. And what happened was the library created oh, you know what? That's coming up. We'll get to that in a second. Sorry. Let's stick with this one. So libraries as public spaces. Is there a difference in who gets to use them free of threat? So when you think about a park, on the right there is a beautiful, one of my favorite spots in Chicago. It's a shot from the Montrose Bird Sanctuary on the north side of the city looking south. And then on the left is the children's room in the Little Village branch of the Chicago Public Library. Is there a difference between these two spaces in terms of acceptable behavior, who gets to enjoy the spaces in certain ways and who doesn't? So people of color, homeless folks, people with disabilities or in crisis, or even just neurologically or cognitively atypical, people who are emotional, people who are singing, people who are making noise. How are they treated in various community spaces by white folks and police compared to other people? And when you think about the terrible situation of the folks who were grilling in the park, I can't remember where that occurred, but the white woman who called the police on a group of Black folks enjoying, thank you, yeah, Oakland. I saw a lot of stuff on Twitter about grilling while Black, and it's become a kind of, it's not funny in any way, a macabre almost comment, and fill in the blank while Black becomes unacceptable. And the same thing can happen in the library spaces. So if you can imagine it as something that someone will call the police on a patron for, it will probably happen or has. And that can be patrons, it can certainly be library staff. And as librarians, and library staff, we often like to congratulate ourselves that we're very progressive, that we are very empathic and compassionate, and we're a high-minded sort of folk. However, I'm sure everyone here agrees that they know a lot of people they work with who are quite conservative. And I certainly know that there have been a lot of people that I shouldn't be shocked, because, and that's the thing, that's the bubble of what we study and who the librarians we connect with, the library staff and colleagues we work with that we really see eye to eye with. It becomes a little bit of a bubble, because then I feel shocked when, somebody says something, I can't believe that they're thinking that. And I always come back to it's 2021. How are you thinking that? How have you not evolved? But so let's go to the next slide. what I'm getting at is the problem ultimately of white supremacy. How do libraries, how do public spaces reinforce systemic racism and white supremacy? What kind of space is the library? What is this? Who is the space for? And specifically, what is a community and who are the people in it? Are they all welcome, even those who are in crisis? Or are they supposed to go somewhere else when they're dealing with that stuff? Because we can't deal with it. I think they're valid questions because oftentimes we're short-staffed. We don't have training in social work. We don't have a social worker on site. We don't have a safety staff sometimes, and we don't have a way to even communicate with one another while we're on the public-facing floor. So should that person who's disrupting everything or is in crisis still be here? I would argue yes. I would argue that actually the work that we need to become more comfortable, much more comfortable with, is sitting with the person in crisis, working with the teenager who is very disruptive, no matter how long it takes. Now, some people might roll their eyes and say, well, that's not going to happen. How are we supposed to do that? I'm supposed to sit with a kid for, 35, 40 minutes, and talk with them and see what's going on when, like, I've got a line of patrons over here who all need books and the new James Patterson. Yes, but you're not supposed to do that within the systems as we've built them right now, as they are now. This kind of work, I think, requires an overhaul of service models. And that needs to come from the ground up and the top down. I think we need to both be doing the work. Unfortunately, it's often from the ground up because administrators don't want to rock the boat. They've got a board that pressures them that often is more conservative than a lot of staff. And it's a long haul sort of project. But what number one, what is being communicated? What information is being provided when you call the police versus what is communicated when you sit and talk with someone or find a peaceful, sort of compassionate solution where you just keep trying to find ways to solve the problem that doesn't involve armed backup. One situation that I had actually was with the vending machine boy. He and I had gotten to know each other over the years. And one day he came in and he was just like on a tear, coming in just like so loud, joking about everything. And I thought he was being pretty aggressive, just like, because he was making fun of a lot of people. And then he started making fun of me. And right before he'd walked in, I'd heard that there had been a bomb threat at my daughter's school. And so I was thrown back on my heels and in a state of fear. He comes in, so I'm very vulnerable, and he starts making fun of my face and my name. He's just not being kind. And I got so angry, and we got into this protracted argument that was back and forth. And like, I raised my voice, he raised his voice. It was not productive. And luckily we had on staff, and always have on staff, someone called the librarian in charge. This was my friend and colleague, Amy Kuster. Amy came in, and she came in with a completely different mindset. And she was able to mediate a conversation between me and David in which we both came to very sincere apologies. And I actually got kind of teary-eyed at one point about how I had communicated with him, and also just the fact that I told him a little bit about what had happened before he came in, and it really wasn't about him. And then he apologized, for just coming in like really, really larger than life. And the next day, David was very sweet. We saw each other in the lobby, and he came up and he gave me a handshake and a little like bro hug. But that was a situation because David had been getting so angry that I could see someone hearing us outside the room to be like, oh, I got to do something. I'm just going to call the police. But instead, luckily, I called the librarian in charge. So I had backup that was much more appropriate for the situation. So when other patrons see us sitting with a patron and trying to work things out, we're conveying that compassion matters, and that this person matters, and that as a member of our community, we care and actually want to help them out, because that's information service work also. what can you do right now to help yourself, or what can we do to help? Who can we call for you that would make you feel better, so on and so forth. And then look at internal policy. Oftentimes it's applied unequally and it reinforces white supremacy. The internal policies often end up with people being suspended for, what they'll call offensive odor or volume, and then the question is whose volume is more offensive than someone else's volume, because all teens are loud, but oftentimes it's the ones who don't look like me who are suspended. What are our internal policies on suspensions? Do we try to avoid them? What does a suspension tell a teenager or a child about how welcome they are at the library, and what do they interpret that to mean about themselves and their place in the community? I think we have to ask so many questions, and that's really, Talia, build relationships, gasps. But a lot of people think that it's not their role as a information provider, as a librarian. I'm not going to build relationships. I'm just here to provide you with the information. And I just think we have to challenge that sort of thinking, because otherwise we're just going to keep reinforcing systems in which, Black patrons and patrons of color and people who are the other are carted away in squad cars, handcuffed, and sometimes violated. And it's not okay. We've got to be a source of progress in this culture, in our country, and not a source of reinforcement of the worst impulses and histories and practices of this country. So look at those internal policies and analyze whether they're applied equally or not. And then analyze, do we have a policy about calling the police? If we don't, maybe we should develop one. And there will be a lot of pushback, I believe, because a lot of people think, well, you can't, no pun intended, handcuff my ability to keep myself safe. It's my right to call the police. And yeah, it's true. And police, unfortunately, always tell people, you know what, when in doubt, call us, we'll be there. And I know I hate that. And I hate it because I like it when firefighters say it, only because usually it's call us if you are smelling smoke. But in this situation, no, I don't think call us when you're in doubt. I think that we can set, and I haven't thought through exactly what, or I haven't written down exactly what, we can set, what are those guidelines for calling the police? Is there a weapon in view? Recently at Skokie Library, there was a weapon in view being waved around by a white guy, and he did not have the police called on him. And I remember safety staff was feeling really upset that they were told not to call the police. And I see from their point of view why that is. This person was acting very erratic, and they had a weapon that was dangerous out and was actually waving it around. So I think even opening up these conversations with, specifically if you have security or safety staff, finding out, how do they approach situations? What is their policy on calling the police? Do we have an internal policy that even talks about it? And it doesn't even have to be official conversations. I would say some of the biggest progress we've made at Skokie Library is because my supervisor, Laurel Johnson, took, and her predecessor, Shauna Anderson, they were so adamant about not involving police in teen lives that they completely shifted the culture of youth services and the safety staff in regards to how they approach teens and solve whatever issues are arising throughout the day. Can we go to the next slide? Oh, there it is. So, are DEI trainings enough? I would argue no, because Evanston Public Library has a history of questionable actions when it comes to police issues. They had a sort of high profile case a couple of years ago where the library sort of removed itself from an association with a program that was going on at the library about police brutality. Like they wouldn't, the director didn't want their name on it in any way. And it was sort of a slap in the face to the organizers because it had always been a partnership. And then also there was an issue where some FOIA materials revealed that the library was intentionally collecting pro-police children's books. And then they really seemed to like, hunker down and be like, we are doing DEI, we are doing professional development and trainings to talk about bias, to talk about racism, to talk about white supremacy. We're digging in. And for the last few years, that's really been the case. But then a month ago, one of their staff, and I have no idea who, I don't think it matters. The irony is they made a display to tie in with a police reform program going on at Northwestern. And it was like a forum or panel discussion about reforming police and, really changing policing. So it was actually a pretty progressive event, and it had like a pro community, much less pro police sort of viewpoint. The irony is, so then the library put up this display to promote that event, and then I don't know, whoever was creating the display thought maybe we should have an alternating viewpoint or opposing viewpoint, or show that there's like two sides to the issue. And they put up, I don't think it was an actual Blue Lives Matter, like or thin blue line flag. I think it was like a printout of one and then like put inside like a plastic display. I need to get more info on it, but still they put it as part of it. And maybe it was a staff member who did it rogue and was like, screw this display, I'm going to put up what I really think and put it there. I know that some really, really compassionate, caring people were deeply upset about on staff about the fact that this iconography of fascism and white nationalists and white supremacy was like in a library display less than a year after white supremacists tried to, stage an insurrection and take down the Capitol and kill people in Congress, waving that flag. And so, the issue really came to the fore because Black patrons spoke up and were horrified. And so it became this mea culpa. There's this huge, I think you can still read the apology on their website, I believe, or it's in the sort of archives on the website. But the reason I ask about the DEI training, is that enough? And I would argue no, because often it's just talk, it delves into abstractions, and then we end up with something like this. What bias led me, or what ignorance led me to put this flag up on this display and undermine and also hurt people who saw it. Could you go to the next slide, please? Okay, I'll go through this quickly, but the reason I list all this is because people often ask, what do we need to do to reduce policing in our spaces? And so when you're public facing, ask yourself, do you have staff to back you up if an incident occurs that requires extensive intervention? Do you have people that you can say, hey, I got to deal with this, but I have patrons at the desk, or I just need someone to watch the desk, but I really want to serve this person who's in a state or is just doing X, Y, and Z. Do you, if you do, then you're supported. What we heard often is that people will call the police because they're just like hard pressed. Who else am I going to call? And the police are like, call us for anything. And so they've called the police because they like see someone shouting or throwing books, and they're just like, police will deal with it. I got to go to the next patron because I got no one else. Do you have a way to quickly communicate with others on staff? At Skokie Library, we use this walkie-talkie system called a Vocera. It's like a closed network. I can go call youth services, and the first person signed into youth services who's on the floor will answer. I can say, call, Bob Mason, and Bob Mason will pick up. Call maintenance, call safety. And so call safety was key because they would pick up immediately. And you could also call, and I think this goes to number 3, is there a librarian in charge? Do you have somebody who is viewing everything, what's going on, and is keeping track of what's happening in the library, who needs support and backup, and when? Librarian in charge, I think, is huge, because I would argue that I think libraries should reach out to police departments and ask them, hey, when you come to the library, unless it's like an emergency you're like running through, could you please ask the first staff you see to tell the librarian in charge that you're there? Because oftentimes we're just like surprised. Librarian in charge should be aware that there's police and probably go to that situation as soon as possible. 4, do you have dedicated safety team with experience in de-escalation, social work, housing, and compassion for the patrons? This is huge because a lot of libraries are like contracting out with private security. Sometimes it's armed private security, which is disastrous. Armed either with guns or with tasers, either one, it's absolutely dangerous and disastrous. And then also there are libraries that have nobody. I think that our safety staff at Skokie, which we worked so closely with them in teen services. We had somebody who was years in working in shelters for unhoused folks. We've got a special education high school teacher, another person from a shelter, and then interestingly, we had a London police officer. She was fantastic because she had a completely different approach to policing, and it really had to do with building up people instead of tearing them down or putting them away. So if you do have a safety staff, I would encourage trying to change it's like you're not going to want people to lose their jobs, but if you're looking for new people, I think young adult services folks should speak up because it's absolutely pertinent to your work with teens. Hey, can we be in on interviews? Hey, can we talk to you about what qualifications we want to see in the next safety officer? Can we change it from security to safety? These words matter. And then de-escalation training for staff, do they provide this more than just once a year or once at all? What about mental health first aid trainings? There are places, nonprofits, social service organizations that as part of their work, they come to places like libraries to provide these trainings. And do you get de-escalation training more than once? I think that's key because you have to practice what de-escalation looks like. You have to get used to the kind of uncomfortable way of talking and standing that sort of, it doesn't feel natural. And sort of, it's not just a once and done sort of issue, but I really think it's key. And also it provides you the tools to be able to handle situations that you might otherwise go like, call the police. Does your library have a social worker on site? To Evanston Public Library's credit, they have 2 social workers on site, and I know that they're used. They're used by quite a few patrons who I think previously would have had the police called on them because of, just different situations or emotions that they were feeling and how they were expressing them. Does your library provide mandatory restorative justice trainings? Shauna Anderson, my supervisor's predecessor at Skokie, was big on restorative justice and the practices of working with individuals, especially youth, to identify what they might have done to harm or tear the fabric of our community in the library and what they can do to repair it. I really think that's a huge, very empathic and meaningful practice that is one in a toolbox that we need to build. Do your patrons know that you're there to help and they don't need to take situations into their own hands? We talked about that. That's the, reducing patron calls. And then do you have access to an extensive directory of social services and contact numbers for those services available in your town? Have you and the library staff built relationships with people at those organizations? And I would encourage everyone to think outside the box. When you're thinking social services, that could be Narcotics Anonymous sponsors. That could be folks who work, with sexual assault survivors. Cast the net wide and build as many relationships. Again, there's that gasp-worthy phrase, build relationships and get to know what they can do and what skills they have, and when to call them. And you'll find, I think, that a number of patrons have relationships already with some of the folks at these places. We just can't live in a silo. We can't be, if you're siloed from the community, then it's easier to feel helpless. And again, we're trained from like early age that the police are the ones to call. And I think we need to take just a more longer approach. And then, oh, and build that directory if you don't have it, like make that a committee. I found out after 5 years at Skokie Library that we had that directory and it was buried in the intranet. I had no idea it existed. It was not part of my onboarding. It was not part of my training. I had no idea we had this extensive directory. And I know that what I love about Evanston Public Library's website is they provide the directory on the website. So people can also do their own research to find help. I'm a huge advocate for that. My first work in like information services was reception, receptionist for, or administrative sort of assistant for the ACLU of Illinois. And I had to take legal intake calls and refer, 97% of the people to other agencies. And I had to know that book and who those people were and what they could do for them. I think we just need to catch people where they are, and they're often at the library. So, and then is your staff trained to understand child and adolescent development? I can't say that enough. Viewing teens behaving a certain way and seeing that as criminal versus viewing teens behaving a certain way and viewing that as appropriate developmentally, and because of their age, being something that you can understand, whether or not it's appropriate for the space or the context. You understand where it's coming from and you can work with them because there are youth who are still learning. Can we go to the next slide? Leading from that last point is this slide about the fog of implicit bias. Oftentimes the fog of the biases that we've been trained in, or we exist in a fog that makes it hard for us to determine what we're really seeing. I like this picture because you see it doesn't matter who it is, you see a person in a lonely fog-filled field wearing black sort of in the distance, and it's creepy. Like this, I Googled lone person in fog, and I got so many creepy images. And so if you think about the unconscious messages we've received about other people and about threat and about danger and what dangers other people pose to us because of certain like indicators about them, whether it be their skin color or how they behave, it creates a fog that clouds our judgment. And so when people hear that, they go, how am I supposed to know when is a real threat and when I shouldn't call the police and when I should? And I argue that we have to reflect on our own biases before a situation occurs. And so by saying that, what I mean is we need to start doing that if we're not already, and do it all the time. The work never stops challenging ourselves and the things that we feel, and noticing when we walk down the street and we have an internal reaction to somebody walking towards it. Why is that? Is it a true threat? Is there some kind of indication? Is there legitimate fear because of the way this person is, or because of the fog in which I exist? How can we clear the fog? We need to challenge ourselves. What is my first thought when I see a group of Black boys roughhousing? Even if you know what's developmentally appropriate for 15 and 16-year-olds, the fog of implicit bias is such that you can see a group of 15 and 16-year-olds and think those are 25 and 26-year-olds, because we're trained that Black females are older than they actually are, and Black males are bigger and more threatening and older than they are. So that's fog too. We can know the developmental milestones and what's appropriate for the age, but if we're misinterpreting a child for who they are because of our bias, that's the knowing those milestones in development, it just doesn't even apply. It's moot. How do I react to teenagers being loud and physically awkward? Do I view that as a fight? as a threat, as something that's going to tear this library to pieces? Or do I realize those are kids? They're rambunctious. They've been cooped up in school all day. Really, a lot of times it has to do with placing yourselves in the shoes of other people. What's my first emotion when I hear a Black mother upset with her child? Is that, an abusive person? Or is that, as many white people are trained to think, or is that, like any parent, somebody who has had it up to here? And can you ask them, is there any way I can help? They might be like, no, get out of here. Okay. But library workers must think through situations in anticipation of them to avoid relying on police. So I can't stress this enough. Like, the work has to be preventive right now. We have to think through, and this is something, what does this look like? In teen services, we met every single day with safety staff in the 10 minutes before 3 o'clock when the middle school let out, to talk through behaviors of certain kids we knew the day before, kids we hadn't seen in a while, kids who might be suspended but are trying to get back in, and we make plans. So we're all on the same page, and youth services usually had a representative at those meetings. I found they were so helpful. But also what was great is sometimes, like, some crap went down the night before and we just couldn't take care of it right then, but it didn't need to be handled like immediately. That's why taking a day and then meeting and then saying, all right, we're going to circle back with this person because we have to have a conversation about the day before. You don't have to let things go, but it also, if you're not in a place where you can respond appropriately, or you don't have backup, maybe it's not something to handle right now, but something to come back to. Can we go to the next slide? Thanks for sticking with me, everyone. All right, so, and this is, if there's one thing I just want to leave you with is, asking, when people say, how do I know when to call the police and when not to? Ask yourself this question: do I need armed backup for this situation? Most times the answer is no, because when you bring in the police, you're bringing, I was in a Starbucks today and there was a cop sitting behind me. I was actually working on these slides, kind of hope he read them. And he was jacked up with like bulletproof vest. Like he wasn't like officer friendly. This guy looked ready for war, and he was in Starbucks chatting it up with the employees and stuff. And I was just like, imagine calling that because like a mom is yelling at her kid or yelling at her husband or, whoever. And you're bringing in somebody who is trained to neutralize with force, take away, or arrest, or both, arrest and take away, or just remove, take away, or use force. And that is incredibly dangerous because they are on a hair trigger they're trained. And I've watched police training videos. They are trained, to have they've got the hand on the hip. And the reason we hear about the shooting, why did the cop shoot, 12 times? They're trained to do that. They're neutralize means until they're not moving anymore. And so think about the unconscious bias they bring in, and they might come in for this situation and then see an entirely different situation with a group of kids or whatever, and then that triggers something in them. It's like playing with matches in a barn full of hay. Next slide. This is just a quick no. If anybody says, hey, we want to do coffee with a cop, please advocate to get rid of it. It's just an image brandishing sort of activity for the police. And there's no reason you don't know who the police are that they're going to be bringing in. You're in the business of providing accurate, good information. You're not a marketing arm of the police department. Also, there's some suggestion that this is used as intelligence gathering. The more the cops can be in the space, seemingly innocently, the more they can sort of scout things and people. Next slide. So this is a new slide that I created. And it's just some people, I imagine, in this climate that we're in, June 2020, there was incredible activism and and protest. And, you know, some of the whitest people I know were sharing on social media, you know, I can't breathe memes and Black Lives Matter iconography and so on and so forth. And some of those same people have ranted to me, to my horror, that they can't believe critical race theory and what's being done. I mean, some of these same people. And so we're in a place right now where propaganda from the right and from police has actively and absolutely ripped the discourse from where it was, I believe, in June 2020 to an entirely new pro-police, pro-white supremacy sort of foundation. People are operating from that point of view right now, and it's horrifying to me. So you may get comments like, this sounds ridiculously woke, or some kind of CRT thing. If I feel unsafe, I'm calling the cops. And I'm talking, this might be a colleague, this might be an administrator, but I think we need to push back on like the use of woke as some kind of like dismissive, ridiculous stand-in for like politically correct, because it's the new politically correct. We're talking about lives. We're talking about people's lives being at risk. We're talking about human beings who are disproportionately brutalized and hurt and violated, and that is not acceptable. So you could respond, maybe kindly. Please don't use empty catchphrases like woke to dismiss me when I'm talking about protecting the health, lives, and safety of our patrons. I know that's something we both want. I'm sorry, but if crimes are being committed, why wouldn't I call the police? And then you could say something. I mean, I just like sort of spitballed these responses. I'm sure we can all brainstorm others, but we could say, you know, we all can misinterpret what's happening in our spaces as crimes and could unwittingly unleash like armed forces on children and teens and parents and families here who might be brutalized or incarcerated, taken away from their families, even killed because of our mistake. Don't you think that's something we need to make sure we don't do? And then you could also say, you know, many crimes do not need armed backup now. By calling them here in response to, say, theft or vandalism, we're exposing all our patrons to the potential for violence. Patrons that had nothing to do with the vandalism could be sitting over here, and the police will insert themselves into a situation if they feel like it. That's not why we're here. We're not here to expose everyone to policing. Next slide. I sort of already touched on this. I just like to share the images of Black folks, Black librarians in the library. We could go to the next slide. But one thing I do want to mention is, you know, there were a number of librarians when Hidden Figures came out who thought that the scene where one of the characters was not allowed to use the white part of the library was an egregious sort of misrepresentation of libraries. And I was really baffled and kind of upset. I was upset to hear them say that, because it indicated, A, they didn't know the history of white supremacy in libraries and the white supremacist sort of underpinnings of who gets to pursue knowledge and who gets access to quality resources and who doesn't. And the fact that that scene was absolutely realistic, and they thought that that was the most unrealistic part of that movie, not, say, Kevin Costner like knocking down the sign to the bathroom, was very telling. And so we can't forget that, like any institution, libraries were forged in the fire of white supremacy. That doesn't mean that libraries are always white supremacist or always have to be white supremacist. They're like democracy and like America. There's so much promise, but there's so much that has been done horribly and criminally and violently to harm people, and it needs to end. And so by knowing our own history, and this is where we get to that like critical race theory sort of boogeyman, you know, what they're really advocating for is our children learning truth and knowing accurate information to know who we really are so that we can move forward into a more just future. And I think in libraries, we have to do that work of acknowledging who we've always been, who we are now, having the humility to admit that, yeah, I was raised in this fire called America, and it has burned me with a lot of unconscious biases that I need to heal within myself. I need to address those wounds before, I contribute to harming anyone else. And this slide, Dr. Knox and I end with because it reminds us of the stakes. These are portraits of folks who have been killed by the police. And the reason they are only partially colored in is because the artist only colored them in certain increments for as many years as they were alive. And so you see the youngest ones have barely a smidge of color, or the oldest ones might have a little bit more. But I found it to be a very powerful reminder of the stakes, which is that human lives are at stake. And we're not just about books and, information, resources, and guides, and so on and so forth. We're about people and community. So that's my presentation. The last slide is further resources that I've collected, and there's others I can add to it, but this is really what has driven a lot of my thinking and a lot of my speaking on this topic in the last year. I had personally plotted out till 5:30 or 4:30 Central in my mind, so I'm happy to stay here and take questions, work through things with people for 12 more minutes if anyone wants to stay and talk, but I completely understand if you need to go. I think I ran over, but I really appreciate you all being here through all of it and listening through. It really matters. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So important. You're getting a lot of kudos. And I think for 60 some people to hang out after time says a lot about the topic and the need for the discussion. No, seriously.
Okay.
So we've got maybe 10 minutes or so for questions. And I know that Amy had a comment. Amy, if you're still here, please feel free to unmic.
Yeah, I'm currently a high school librarian in an international school in southern Vietnam. So not really in the public system at all at the moment, though I have been in America. And the way the Vietnamese live in southern Vietnam, where it's warm, is a lot of life happens outside. Houses aren't big. Life happens outside. I just keep walking around and thinking, if I was in America, all these people would be arrested for loitering. Like all of them, because like at the end of my street is a cul-de-sac and people will just roll up, sit down, spread out a blanket, eat lunch. But if I was in a white neighborhood in America and people that looked different than I did rolled up in my neighborhood, rolled up in my cul-de-sac and spread out a blanket, somebody would call police about it.
Yes.
And so it's so important to know your community and what their cultural norms are, because they may not be your cultural norms, but they're totally norms.
Yeah, and there's so much fear in America that keeps us inside and suspects people in gatherings. I don't know if you've seen the book Palaces for the People, but it's a great book about the importance of public spaces and actually how public spaces encourages people of different groups, of different interests, just to coexist peacefully with each other. And it has a profound sort of unconscious message that we absorb, which is that like, they're cool over there, I'm cool over here, like, and we're all together and we're just people hanging out. But you're right, I live near Winnetka, Illinois, which is like so wealthy and so quiet.
I have a nephew with a house in Winnetka.
Okay. And I think of there's this one beautiful park in the middle of Winnetka, and I thought, it's a public park. There's no reason that anyone couldn't drive up from Chicago and have a barbecue there. But you're absolutely right that would be very dangerous. One thing that I didn't mention from the in the presentation is I saw a presentation, one of many that I've seen with Jason Reynolds, and I want to say it was the day after the George Floyd video really hit widely, and he was speaking with the owner of Loyalty Bookstore in DC, and both of them seemed not totally up to talking today, but they got their footing, of course. But he said what I thought was a very simple, very powerful message, which is mind your own business. Let us be and mind your own business. This is a guy who writes for children and teens, and he has been walking down the street in Bedford-Stuy and thrown up against a wall by police for walking down the street. And he said, no matter how much, he said, man, I write books for children and I'm just going to the store. They didn't want to hear it. And, he just said, mind your own business, because that's really what it comes down to.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there other questions that Jarrett can field? And Jarrett, not to put you on the spot, but folks have been asking for the slides. So is it okay if we post them?
Yeah, so Kiara's got them, right? So absolutely, for sure.
Okay. And we have the links of the different books and things that people have been posting. So we will, in the ProPublica and things, so we will post them as well.
So Christian just asked a very important question. And thank you for bringing this up, Christian, because it speaks to some other questions I've gotten in other sessions, which is, what about harassment, sexual harassment, and someone who exposes themselves, and also libraries that are sort of used as like a trading spot for a drug trade. So I don't have an answer for that. What do you recommend? I mean, that's potentially very traumatizing for other patrons, and is a very serious thing. What do others think? No one's ever asked me about the exposing themselves thing, but I know at Evanston Library that happened quite a bit, and I think was a reason for a lot of police calls. Also, people urinating in the stacks, stuff like that, having intercourse in the stacks. I don't know. You can ask folks to leave without calling the police. Exactly, Sarah, and that can be addressed head on. However, it can also be intimidating based on, who is the person who has to go address that situation. But again, we should all be trained to be able to be confident, regardless of who the person is and who we are, to go have that conversation, and also have backup. There should be absolutely another librarian with you, or a staff with you. Safety staff shouldn't be you on your own. And again, that's a problem with a lot of these like shoestring budget libraries that have barely any staff, and sometimes it's a person alone in a like 2-room library. My heart goes out to those people, because I've never had that experience. I've always had like a huge staff to call on. But yeah, people can be asked to leave, and then also, if they leave, which they hopefully do without an incident, you can then also follow up with the people who might have been harmed by that situation. So instead of just ignoring that it happened, again, like recognizing, I like to think of the fabric of community, and when there are tears, when something is like torn apart or torn open, or a stitch is sort of just like worried until it's ripped up, and a big hole appears. That person exposing themselves might leave, but the harm to the fabric is still there, especially if like people had witnessed it or had been like intentionally on the receiving end. I don't know. People have different responses to things, and want justice, and I understand it. And the other people also have the right themselves to call the police and press charges. But I think as a library, I don't know that would call for the police. I don't know.
So Jarrett, we do
Yeah.
have to close.
Wrap up.
Yeah. But I wanted to just thank you so much for this thought-provoking conversation. And it's certainly a conversation that we need to continue having. So if I know that folks may still have questions, if you want to send them to me at Twitter at Baker Chair, I can certainly forward them to Jarrett, and see if he can, walk you through a couple things. And just a final reminder that today's recording will be on our webpage next week. And we have one more critical conversation on December 2nd with Cindy Landrum, who will be talking about community inquiry. So we hope to see you there as well. And so just thank you all again for your great questions and your comments and really your engagement over the last 90 minutes or so. You are so appreciated. So thank you again, Jarrett. Thank you everyone for coming. And we will talk again soon. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks, everyone.